So, I read a book this weekend that I think may have kind of changed my life. And I don't know where this book has been all of my life, but it's actually been around for a very long time. I just finished Dracula and gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Now, I had owned this book for over a year and it's just been sitting on my shelf. I bought it kind of on a whim. I think I had recently read Frankenstein when I bought it, and I liked Frankenstein, so I was like, hey, maybe I'll like that too. Well, I finally picked it up this October, and by the way, October is an absolutely perfect time to read this book, and I was absolutely floored, and I just had to talk to somebody about it, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it. And while I talk about it, I'm going to be crocheting this blanket. So, first of all, I want to talk about who this book is for because I think that there's a lot more vampire stuff coming out now that's like cool, but I feel like if your only perspective on vampires is Twilight and you always thought Twilight and Vampire Diaries was stupid and you think you're not going to like Dracula, man, I I think you're wrong. I think that who is going to like this book is anybody who loves a good gothic classic, specifically gothic horror, who loves to just be enveloped in a creepy ambiance, and anybody who is really interested in discussions on religion and kind of how religion affects people's motivations and outlook on the world will really enjoy this book. So, I have come up with a rating system to talk about this book that I think will be helpful. So, I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars, but to kind of help me explain to myself and to you why I love this book so much, we're going to look at 5 different categories. So I've decided that the 5 categories are going to be genre value, ambiance quality, prose quality, entertainment value, and story value. And I think that will just kind of help us organize our thoughts. So, for the first one, genre value. So, for this, I'm really kind of just asking, did the story do what it was trying to do? So, whenever I looked up kind of what a gothic classic slash gothic horror was supposed to entail, I found the following things. Gothic horrors are known for dark settings, foreboding atmospheres, supernatural and spiritual elements, and some of the romantic elements, which include obviously romance, heroes, nature, lots of those different things borrowed from the Romantic era. So, Dracula has all of these. So Dracula not only has all of these, but does them all exquisitely. And so because of that, I have to give the genre value category a 5 out of 5. And that's not really surprising because Dracula is usually cited as kind of the poster child of the gothic horror genre. So it's not really a surprise that it does all these things really well. And the other interesting thing is Dracula was published in 1897, and that was actually right at the end of the Gothic classic slash Gothic horror era in literature. So I think that's kind of interesting too because I think that allowed Bram Stoker, the author, to kind of pull all the greatest hits, right? All of the best things from this genre. And I think that this book really is kind of the culmination of the genre because, not a lot of people tried to do it after he did. So this truly is a masterpiece. And so what I mean about how this book kind of took all of the greatest elements from Gothic horror is because at the very beginning, so Gothic horror started in the late 1700s, and there were books written that focused a lot more heavily on the supernatural element, so kind of more like man versus nature, definitely like kind of evil and religious things going on as well. But then as the genre progressed, so then we get into the 1800s, and that is when Frankenstein was published. And Frankenstein was kind of a turning point in the genre because Frankenstein represents more, obviously, with still all of the great supernatural and religious elements, but it also represents more of the human side of that and the struggle of kind of man versus himself, but in the context of, moral and religious themes. And so then when we get Dracula, I think that we really get all of that in one, because we do have Dracula, who it seems like from, the few little snippets that we learn about the backstory of Dracula is he was at one point a man, and apparently like a great person and super smart, had all these things going for him. But then also we, of course, have this huge man versus nature aspect, because now Dracula is like this monster, and Dracula represents all of the evil in the world, and represents, well, I don't even know if I should say represents, because they actually call him the devil. So I don't even know, I mean, that's a little on the nose. I don't know if it's supposed to be a representation or like he is actually the devil. So that's kind of how Dracula fits into the genre. So back on some of those characteristics that we listed. Dark settings, yes, Dracula does settings so well. And Dracula also has several different settings that we kind of go throughout the story, and each one of them are just everything you could ask for a dark setting. So, for example, we have Castle Dracula, which is this huge abandoned castle with only one very creepy, very sinister, scary person, Dracula, living there. And then even in the area where the castle is located, the Carpathians / Transylvania, the way that landscape is also described is like very desolate, and the people are like very superstitious. Like all of that is very dark and creepy too. And then, we also have the other setting of Whitby, which is a coastal town in the United Kingdom, where we spend a little bit of time, and that seems, like a little bit of a breather at first, but then, we end up, of course, spending a lot of time in the Whitby Cemetery at night, and the cemetery is very creepy, and then we have all of these men of the sea that are telling all of these like crazed tales. And so then that starts to make that whole atmosphere. That atmosphere kind of starts out very bright and like this nice, relaxing vacation spot, and then quickly gets to be a very dark setting in our mind as we progress through the story. So I think that's interesting too. And then, I mean, what else? We also have an insane asylum. I mean, you can't get a darker, creepier setting than that. Yeah, so I think that it really hits the settings well. And then, that goes hand in hand with the foreboding atmosphere. And when I came across the description, when I was looking at these characteristics of Gothic horror, whenever I came across foreboding atmosphere, I was like, yes, foreboding is the perfect word that I've been looking for to describe the atmosphere of this book, and that's exactly it. And I think that man, it's just done so well. And I'm going to save that one and talk more specifically about it once we get to the ambiance section. But for now, we'll just say, yes, big check mark on that one. And then I've already talked a little bit about the supernatural and spiritual elements. We definitely have that going on. And I also want to save that for talking about the story value. So, another thing that is really reminiscent of the Gothic horror style, or just Gothic classics in general, is a narrative device that is some kind of manuscript within the story, is a thing that you'll often see in Gothic literature. And in this book, the whole story is told through the letters and diaries of our main characters. And I just love that narrative device in general, but it was done so well here. And I just loved it. I thought that it really helped us get into the mind of our characters, and it was just executed so well. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well. So that's the genre value, 5 out of 5. The next one that I want to talk about is the ambience quality. So I'm also giving this a 5 out of 5. And for the ambience quality, it makes me ask, how vividly did I experience this book and how immersive was it? And ambiance is probably one of the, just for me personally as a reader, ambiance is one of the biggest things for me. Because I think one reason for that is I think some people, when they're reading, see kind of a movie in their mind. They kind of visualize what's happening. I really don't have that. Rarely do I have that. And so when I experience a book, it's really more about how the book makes me feel and how kind of present I am within it. So I think that's why it's so big for me. So, yes, we have the foreboding atmosphere. And I think that there are several different ways that this is achieved in this book. And first of all, I just want to say, to achieve such a tangible ambiance that carries through an entire book of this length. I mean, this book is not short, it's almost 500 pages. And to just carry that ambiance throughout the book, and then it has different ways that it kind of morphs and changes as things get more intense, I think is a very impressive feat. And so I think there's a couple things that contribute. So first of all, there's really good pacing in this book. And it's just really good pacing because the tension ebbs and flows so perfectly that just keeps you locked in the whole time as you move through the different settings and keep developing the story. And so, you're so immediately gripped by the book when you start out in Jonathan Harker's diary, and so Jonathan Harker is this young lawyer. He's just passed the bar exam, or sorry, solicitor. We're in England. And so he's kind of on his first business trip as an attorney. He's supposed to be going to the Carpathians, to Transylvania, to meet with this guy who's trying to get some property in London. Okay. So he's all just ready to take on the world. He's very young. He's very eager. He's just ready to go. He's not really skeptical of anything. And so we're following him, as he kind of makes this journey, which is pretty extensive. He has to, take the train and then get on a carriage and all these different things to get to this very remote, very creepy, deserted place. And so what makes this very foreboding and very immediately gripping is that we see all of these locals are, there's one scene where he's staying in an inn, and this old woman who I guess runs the inn is telling him that he can't travel that night because it's a holiday where during that night out of every year all the evils of the world have its sway, and she's trying to give him this crucifix, and he's just kind of oh, sure. And then he gets on the train the next day to get closer to his final destination, and he's I wonder what all the locals are yelling at me. That's interesting. And he gets out his little dictionary, and he's that's weird. I wonder why they're yelling Satan and Viper at me. And it's just oh my God. So that's one reason that makes it so tense and eerie, because you are scared even before the main character is scared. And so I think that you're just like waiting for him to get with it. So that's very gripping. And then, then the plot just ebbs and flows because you have this super intense first section with Jonathan Harker at Castle Dracula. That's all very intense. But then we kind of take a little bit of a step back when we go to Whitby and we kind of meet Mina and Lucy and we go through their story. But then that quickly takes a very tense turn. And, Lucy gets bitten and she's dying and then she turns into a vampire. And then, they have to figure out how to kill her so that she stops eating the children, so that gets very intense. And then we take another ebb back whenever we get all of our main characters together to then start to try to put a plan together to solve this mystery and to kill Dracula. So I think that having those, I kind of think of it as there's really three separate major plot points or timelines that we kind of go through. And so I think that does a lot for the atmosphere and the tension. And I think another thing that creates that ambiance is reading the letters and diaries, because when you are in the character's head in this way, when you're reading their diary, it's an internal monologue, and so it creates a very intimate feeling. So you're kind of getting all of their thoughts and fears and all of that, and I think that really adds a lot to the ambiance as well. And then finally for ambiance, and this is going to kind of lead us into the next category, but the prose. And that is huge because ultimately I don't know if you could have 5 out of 5 ambiance without really, really good prose. And this story just definitely delivers that. And so that brings us to prose quality. And that again gets 5 out of 5. And I wish that I was better at describing prose. It's one of those things where you read something and you know immediately if you like it or don't like it, but it's very hard to say what you like about it. So I'm going to try. The prose in Dracula it's very beautiful, but yet there's not a word wasted. And I think that's important because I like classics. I've read a good amount of classics, and I do like that style of prose, but sometimes the earlier classics, they have such ornate writing and such flowery language that that's not my favorite. That kind of sometimes will take me out of it a little bit. But I think Dracula, and again, it was written in, 1897. I think that might just be, for one thing, a sweet spot in, the era of this was kind of what was in. The writing it's just very poignant. There's not a lot of extra stuff distracting it, and it just feels very well crafted. And another thing about the prose that is so good, and really, really what brings this to 5 stars, I think, is when we're reading the different characters' perspectives in their diaries and their letters, they have such distinct voices. So whenever we're reading Mina's diary, I think Mina in a lot of ways represents purity, innocence, goodness. I think she kind of embodies that as a character. And that's so evident in reading her letters. She just sounds so, just her tone. She always has hope, and she's always striving for goodness and optimism in a way that is just very palatable through her tone. And then we have, then when we're reading Jonathan Harker's diary, I mean, he's just a very interesting character, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but he is the most dynamic character in the story, and you can see him change very vividly through his writing style and his diary. So that's very compelling. And then another character that we read a lot from is Dr. John Seward. And his writing is, he's a doctor, he's He's in charge of the mental asylum. So his writing is very, I would say, clinical, but then it has kind of that tone of, what's the word I'm looking for? What is the word I'm looking for? I don't know. He just has a very teachable attitude, and he's just kind of writing things down fact for fact as they are, almost more objective. I mean, John Seward definitely has his own, motivations and emotions and things like that. I'm not trying to say that he doesn't have any of those things, but I would say in his recounting of the events, he is very fact oriented. And which is different than somebody like Mina, who Mina is really writing. You get the sense that she is writing from her heart, and Dr. Seward is very much writing from his mind, if that makes sense. So that's the prose. It's just stunning. I wish that I was better at explaining it. Maybe I'll get better at explaining it. Ooh, the next category is very easy. So entertainment value. So for this, I'm also giving it a 5 out of 5. I mean, I was very entertained through the whole book. I mean, I've already mentioned kind of how gripping the beginning is, and then I was just latched on to every part of this book. And I think another thing that made this book so engaging and entertaining was just how many little mysteries and things that there were throughout. Obviously we kind of have this one big culminating quest, but then there's just so many little intricacies throughout that you have to figure out. And then some of them I never really did figure out, and maybe we're not meant to. Like, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was towards the beginning of the book that evil holiday, I think it was like the eve of St. George's Day, there's this part where when they're traveling to Castle Dracula in the carriage, all these blue flames start coming out of the ground, and Dracula gets out of the carriage and like goes away and like does something with the blue flames and then comes back, and then like I think Harker asks about it eventually, and he's just like, oh yeah, like on that holiday the blue flames reveal where buried treasure is. And it's like, what? Like, we never really learn like any more about that. Like, what buried treasure? Like, that's crazy. I can't even picture that. So that's really interesting. And then we also get all these breadcrumbs all along the way, specifically from Dr. Van Helsing. So he's kind of the old doctor. He's kind of in charge. He mysteriously kind of knows a lot about vampires and Dracula specifically. So he is kind of the one always teaching the group all of these different things. You have to like use garlic to ward away the vampires, and just all of these different things that he just knows. So then that's a mystery to me too. Like, I kept waiting to hear, okay, so what's this guy's story? Like, why has he been so interested in vampires his whole life? I don't think that ever really got revealed, but I think Van Helsing needs his own spin-off book. Maybe that exists. Somebody tell me if it does. I'd read it. Yeah, and there's just all kinds of other things that you are so intrigued to unwind. Okay, here's another one that I don't think I was smart enough to figure out. So the mental patient in Dr. Seward's asylum, I'm trying to remember what his name was. It started with an R. And that guy just got so much page time, and he had like this crazy tragic death. And there was definitely something going on with him and Dracula, but he wasn't turned into a vampire. But so his deal was, we kind of meet him earlier on, and Dr. Seward is writing down a lot about this guy, as one of his patients that he's treating, and he catches flies in his room and eats them, and then he progresses on to catching and eating spiders. Okay, and then I think he also eats birds. He uses the spiders to catch birds, and then I think he eats those. And then he's begging Dr. Seward to get him a cat. So, that doesn't that doesn't seem great. And then he just has all these like crazy ramblings about that he thinks he becomes more powerful by eating or by consuming more life. So that's why he's like wanting to eat all of these living things. But so I don't know if he was like under a spell by Dracula. I don't think he was a vampire. I don't know. I never figured that out. So somebody please explain that to me. But I was still very intrigued by it the whole time. So that's the thing. The mysteries that you solve and the other ones that are left as enigmas, they all kept me very entertained and locked in. So I liked that a lot. So yeah, 5 out of 5 for entertainment value. I was entertained. So the last one is, probably the most important one, and that's the story value. So I give the story value for this book a 5 out of 5. I loved this story. This is just a really good, old-fashioned hero's journey story. Good versus evil. The good guys win. I mean, it's so good. And I think a helpful way to look at the story value, this kind of encompasses the characters and the plot and just the overall story and how impactful the story is, how changed you are by the story. And this book really did make me think a lot, and I don't know, I don't really think that I'm somebody who has a lot of deep thoughts, and this still has me thinking. I'm still kind of haunted by this book. So I think that says a lot to the story value. So I just want to talk about the characters really quickly because I just love these characters, and I think all of these characters are so good and serve this story so well. And, I think each character kind of represents something, and I don't know that I'm really the best at picking that out all the time, but I've kind of done my best here, so we'll see. If anybody disagrees, let me know. But the first character that we meet is Jonathan Harker. So I've already kind of talked about him. He kind of comes in all naive, swinging his briefcase and whistling and just ready to take on the world, right? Very naive, not skeptical of anybody. And then, by the time all of our characters are united and have kind of decided that what needs to happen is that they need to find Dracula and kill him. Okay, so by the time we get to that point, in sort of, I would say, the middle of the book, we see a change in Jonathan Harker where now he has lost some of that naiveness, and he's now ready to just go for the greater good. He's ready to, be a hero. But he's still very optimistic. He's ready to go on. It's an adventure to him. He's taking it seriously, but it's an adventure. He's ready to be a hero and get rid of this evil guy, and, he's going to be a hero, which is great. And then then his wife, Mina Harker, in the later half of the book, we find out that she's been bitten, and she is kind of turning. And this is a huge blow to Jonathan Harker, as you can imagine. And there's this one part of the book that was like so intriguing to me, and I kind of reread it again. Like, oh, were they kind of saying that more figuratively? But I think it was like very literal. But there's this one part, I'm pretty sure Dr. Seward writes it in his diary, but it's after Mina's been bitten and kind of the day that they find that out. And Dr. Seward writes in his diary that Jonathan Harker went to bed that night with brown hair, a young, eager man, and he woke up as a old man with white hair, but with just as much energy to, get rid of the enemy. And I just thought that was crazy. And because then later they mentioned something about his white hair. So, I thought that was just, a crazy little tiny detail that happened that I just happened to pick up on. That he, literally turned into an old man with white hair. I'm pretty sure he's, in his 20s. So that was crazy. Um, and then we have Mina Harker. Mina Harker, like I already said, I think that she. So Jonathan Harker, I guess overall, I think he represents human struggle and all of the things that we go through in life that, that make us who we are, that make us capable to do what's needed to do. Because, like I said, in the middle of the book, we have a Jonathan Harker who is idealistic. He wants to get rid of Dracula. He had that horrible experience at Castle Dracula at the beginning, and he knows that's what needs to be done for the greater good. But then when we see him in his old man form at the end, when he is and towards the end he is just brooding and angry, and there's several scenes of him where everybody else is reacting to something and he's just brooding in a corner, like sharpening his knife or something. Like, he gets very dark at the end. And I just think that is such a stark development. And I think I've kind of lost my train of thought on this, but I just was very, very intrigued with his development. I know what I was going to say. This is how dark he gets. So we go from that idealistic, he needs to get rid of Dracula for the greater good of the world, to when it gets personal for him and his own wife is being turned. There is a scene where he tells Mina that if they can't cure her and they can't, break the curse so that she can turn back to fully human, then he will also become a vampire. And so Jonathan Harker, by the end, is in such a dark place that he's no longer interested in the greater good. He is willing to be part of the problem instead, because of what has happened in his own personal story. And so I think that he's a good character, and I think that he represents just the struggle of man and humanity. So then we get Mina Harker, and she's married to Jonathan Harker. And she, like I said earlier, represents this goodness and sweetness, innocence. She's also very intelligent and witty. And I think that she represents pureness, because we really grow to love Mina throughout the book. She just always has the purest motivations of everybody. She's constantly trying to figure out how to be the best wife that she can to Jonathan, the best friend that she can to Lucy. She's always trying to figure out how she can contribute to, the plan of how to track down Dracula, and just always using her skills for others. And so not only do we grow to love Lucy, but all of the other characters are also very endeared to her. And by the middle of the book, after Lucy has already died, she's the only lady left. So you get the sense that all of the other male characters are very protective of her, and are very endeared to her. And so by the time Lucy gets bitten, which happens towards the end of the book, you kind of have this sense, and the rest of the characters also seem to have this sense that, well, if Lucy has been bitten, and if Lucy can't come out of this curse, and if Lucy completely turns, then we're all screwed, and there's no hope for anybody. Like, if Lucy and all of, or I'm sorry, I'm saying Lucy and I mean Mina. If Mina can't overcome this, then the whole world is damned, basically, to this curse of this great evil. And so Mina's character does a lot to raise the stakes. The very goodness and pureness of the world is kind of what is at stake here, and that's represented through Mina. And we have Lucy, dear Lucy. So Lucy is Mina's best friend, and more towards the beginning of the book, Mina and Lucy are together in Whitby. I think they're kind of like on vacation. And so they're staying there in this nice little seaside town. And Lucy begins sleepwalking, And so Mina's always very worried about this, trying to make sure she doesn't leave the house. And one night she does leave the house, and Mina runs out into the night and finds Lucy in the cemetery. And Mina thinks that she sees somebody kind of standing over Lucy for a second, but then in another second it's gone. So I think she kind of thinks, well, okay, well, maybe I was just seeing something. So she's just glad she found her. She brings her home. But then she has these two little pierce marks on her neck. And so, it doesn't look too bad. So I think, they just kind of think it'll heal in a couple days. And it doesn't heal in a couple days. And Lucy just continues to go downhill. And this is where the doctors get involved. This is where we meet Dr. Seward and Van Helsing. They both come and are trying to help Lucy. I think first Dr. Seward, and then Dr. Seward elicits the help of Dr. Van Helsing, and Dr. Van Helsing, who I've already mentioned is our resident vampire expert, he immediately recognizes what's going on. But I don't think he wants to freak everybody out yet. So he doesn't even really tell Dr. Seward what's going on. He just kind of tells him what to do. So they have to give Lucy all of these blood transfusions. And one of our other characters, Arthur Holmes, is actually engaged to Lucy. So Lucy had 3 marriage proposals on the same day. One of them was actually from Dr. Seward, weird, who's also her doctor, and Arthur Holmes, who she accepted, and this other guy, Quincy Morris, that we'll talk a little bit more about later. And so at this point she's engaged to Arthur Holmes. Dr. Seward's treating her. We bring in Dr. Van Helsing. He's frantically trying to prevent her from becoming a vampire, essentially. And so to do this, he has to prevent Dracula from having access to her to continue feeding on her. That kind of seems key for the turning. It doesn't seem to be that you just get bit once and then you turn into a vampire. It's kind of a process. You get bit and then he keeps trying to come back through her window. So anyways, Dr. Van Helsing gets Lucy all set up with some garlic to ward off the vampire, which is working. But then one day, Lucy's mom goes in there and takes all the garlic down because she thinks it smells bad and she doesn't know what it's for, so she takes it down. So anyways, you know what happens. Dracula gets in there in the night, and then Lucy's kind of a goner. She dies. And then she is undead. And so then this is kind of where... So Lucy is kind of used in this story, I think, to just demonstrate how somebody becomes a vampire and what happens. So we kind of go through this whole journey with Lucy, and Dr. Van Helsing is gradually giving us more and more information. And, then finally he kind of tells the others, which are Dr. Seward and Arthur Holmes, hey, actually, here's what's going on. I don't know how to tell you this, but we're going to have to go into her tomb and cut off her head and put a stake through her heart. And everybody's, of course, what are you talking about? And so then we kind of go through this part where Van Helsing has to prove this to the others because, this is unheard of to them. They don't seem to know about vampires. So he has to prove it to them. So... they'll go stake out in the graveyard and watch her creepily walk around. There's also all these children going missing in the town. And then they realize and see that she is the one capturing and biting the children. So anyways, that's Lucy. And Lucy is also, kind of like Mina. You do get a sense of just innocence from Lucy, right? And interestingly, that seems to be what Dracula preys on. I can't think of anybody mentioned in the book who's turned that is not a young, innocent woman. Except that asylum guy, but I don't think he really got turned. So anyways, I think that Lucy is just a good demonstration of how innocence is overcome by evil. And it also lets us know the stakes for the whole story and the stakes of being turned. Because Lucy is young and beautiful and well taken care of and innocent and good, it's tragic that she dies, but at least everybody can have hope in the fact that she's obviously going to heaven and she'll have eternal rest in heaven and she'll always maintain her goodness and innocence in her legacy, right? But then when she gets turned, well, not only does she not get to go to heaven, she doesn't get to have eternal rest, but she also gets all of her innocence taken away because then she becomes this monster who's preying on children. And so it really is like the worst thing that could happen. And that's also evident in the fact that finally Arthur Holmes does agree that Dr. Van Helsing can cut off her head and drive a stake through her heart. As awful as that is, and as gory as that is, and as unthinkable as that is for Arthur to have done to his fiancée, he realizes that's the only way. So, I think that's the purpose that Lucy serves. And then we've already talked a lot about Dr. Seward. Dr. Seward is the doctor in charge of the insane asylum. As far as what Dr. Seward really represents, I don't know if I have a great handle on that, to be honest. He's definitely important in this story. He's an important character in the story, and I don't know. I don't think I have anything else to say on him. But somebody let me know if you have any ideas of what Dr. Seward represents, because I'd be really interested to hear. And then we have Arthur Holmes. So Arthur Holmes is, out of kind of our main kind of 6 characters. Lucy dies pretty early, so I'm going to say our main 6 characters are Mina and the rest of these men. Arthur Holmes, we don't really hear a lot about him, but he is very important in the story because he's a judge and he's like a high-powered politician. He's a lord and he has a lot of money and influence, and so he's very important later whenever they need things and they need to put their plan into action to track down and kill Dracula. So he serves that purpose in the story. And then he also is avenging Lucy, I would say. So he lost Lucy. He's trying to prevent that same thing from happening to Mina as kind of a vengeance for Lucy, whom he loved very dearly. So, there's some sort of Arthur is kind of a romantic character, I would say. Yeah, that's what I'll say about Arthur. Quincy Morris. So you'll remember Quincy Morris was one of Lucy's unrequited suitors. And Quincy Morris is such a good character, and I did not appreciate him or care about him or pay any attention to him until it was too late. So, I mean, if you've listened this far, this has already been a lot of spoilers, but this is like a pretty big spoiler, so just warning. But Quincy Morris dies on the very last page, and it's very tragic because they've actually just won. There's this crazy intense scene where all of our hero characters are converging on this carriage that's carrying Dracula's coffin, and the sun is about to set, which means Dracula's about to wake up and have his full power, and the carriage is driving hard towards Castle Dracula, which is like immediately in sight, but they get there first, and Jonathan Harker cuts off his head, and Quincy Morris stabs him through the heart. Okay? So it's crazy. And we realize that Mina's curse has been broken. Huge moment. She had this mark on her forehead that was gone. And anyways, it's just very apparent that she's back to fully human. But then we realize that, and this is Mina's diary that we're reading at the very end, and we realize that Quincy has been wounded. He's been stabbed by one of the gypsies that was guarding the carriage, and it's really bad. And he dies. And it's so tragic because it's like, wait a second, that guy, like, first of all, we never read, there may be a telegram or two, but there's no diary from Quincy Morris. I don't think there's any letters. Like, we don't hear hardly anything, if anything at all, from Quincy Morris's own voice. So even though he's in one of our main six, he is really kind of a background character. We just hear about him from other people. And different from all of the other characters, you can't really discern any specific personal motivations that Quincy Morris has to kill Dracula. You know, other than, because we have Jonathan Harker, obviously, his wife is turning. We have Mina, who's, you know, her own soul is in jeopardy. We have Arthur Holmes, who is avenging Lucy. And then we have Dr. Van Helsing, who is like apparently been looking for the vampire's whole life. We have Dr. Seward, who his asylum was like broken into and devastated by Dracula. So, but then Quincy Morris, you kind of realize at the end, he's like the ultimate good guy. He's the good guy. He's the actual hero. He's just like a true servant of the greater good. He wasn't expecting anything in return and certainly didn't get anything in return. He's the one that paid the ultimate price and died for this cause that he had really no personal stakes in. And, you know, even at the end, we just get some lines from him where he's just like, well, you know, it was worth it. It was worth it that Mina's curse was broken and that the world is rid of this evil. So, just needed to give a moment for Quincy Morris. Don't underestimate, don't undervalue Quincy Morris. He's the ultimate good guy. I think that's what he represents in this story. And we need more people like that. Dr. Van Helsing, we've already talked a lot about him. I want to know more about him. I want to know where he learned about vampires. I want to know how he knows all the tricks. Like, he knows about garlic. He knows you have to, like, cut off their head and stab them through the heart. He knows all these things. I want to know where he learned that. That never really gets revealed. He also... yeah, he has a lot of good monologues. You know, obviously he's kind of explaining important vampire knowledge, but other than that, he also I think he's a medical doctor, but he seems to really enjoy philosophy. So he drops a lot of interesting philosophical points about, like, one of them that I'm thinking about right now is, and this is one that I don't even think I totally understood, but it was very interesting. He was talking about how Dracula had, like, he was kind of dissecting the criminal mind and how the criminal mind is very different from, it's more like a child mind, and it's very different from a man mind. And he was talking about how they really need to use their man minds, which... I don't know. That was all. I just honestly feel like I need to reread it. It was very interesting. But he's just always having a lot of interesting discussions like that. He's also, I think he's Dutch. I think. He's not British. The rest of them are British, except for Dr. Van Helsing, and Quincy Morris is from Texas. An adventurer from Texas. So anyways, that's our cast of characters. And that is what they contribute to this amazing story, which I think that this is an important story. It just made me think so much about these characters, who they were, what they mean, and I just loved them. And another thing that had me really thinking after finishing this book was the role of religion in this book cannot be understated. And religion for these characters in this world, in this setting where we are, is not, I don't even know if they needed the word religion in their vocabulary. I don't remember the word religion being in the book, but it's like they didn't need it because it just was. There wasn't really a different option. You know, the existence of God, or at least some higher power, was not a question or a debate or something to like take a position on. It just was. And so that's really what makes this story work, because, you know, if you have read other more modern vampire books, I think that you kind of have this idea in the back of your head of like, okay, but what's the big deal? Like you get turned into a vampire, you live forever, you can like stay young forever, you can continue to get more powerful as time goes on. Like, what's the big deal with being a vampire? Like, is it really that bad? And the role of religion in this book makes you understand the stakes, because, and it's really what I already explained with Lucy. It's like becoming a vampire meant for these characters that you didn't get to go to heaven and you didn't get to have this eternal rest. And then you become a monster and you become evil. And everybody is hoping and striving to be good and for goodness. And it's just such a unifying force for these characters. Now, even though they all have kind of their own individual motivations, you know, and apparently Jonathan Harker's willing to sell his soul for Mina, which is very sweet but also very dark. It's just such a unifying force. And we also have this idea, it's not really super explicitly said what exactly the plan was, but Dr. Van Helsing is telling us that Dracula has been, you know, he's been holed away in this desolate area for centuries, but he's just been building his power that whole time, and his whole plan all along was to come to London and, you know, where the streets are filled with people, and he was just going to feast in the streets. And you kind of get this idea that then like evil will take over the world. Like either everybody will get turned, or, you know, Dracula will just be, he'll just take over, is kind of the idea that you're getting. And so I just thought this is just such a good representation of good versus evil. And I think that a lot of modern stories, the reason maybe why we don't see a lot of these good versus evil stories anymore, is I think we've lost a clear unifying sense of what good versus evil really is. And that kind of made me sad. You know, I think a lot of characters in stories now, or just stories in general, are very morally gray. And I get sometimes that can be done well. I have a lot of stories like that I do love and think are great, but it just also made me sad to feel like, you know, did we lose something huge when we kind of lost religion in our world? And it just feels like we did. And I think having a unifying force, a unifying sense of good and a unifying sense of evil is really important. And, you know, even if we can't have that on a societal scale anymore, I don't know. I think that it's absolutely necessary to have it within yourself. I don't know. I'm not very good at tackling these big topics or explaining them or even thinking about them, but that's just one that has really been sticking with me about this story. And so that's really all that I have to say about this book. It was so good. I hope that you will think about picking up this book, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it and tell me what you learned. So, thank you for listening. Bye.